First, on your absolutely proper focus on China and its relation to the investment issue, let me ask about two things you did not say. You discussed U.S. policy toward inward direct investment and the CFIUS process and made, I thought, a laudable statement that it should be kept narrowly circumscribed to truly national security concerns. There have been stories, rumors, buzz that a number of Chinese investments that they would like to make here have either been rejected by the CFIUS or deterred by the CFIUS process, and that the result is something of a chilling of the atmosphere for Chinese FDI in the United States. So that's one question. The other question, when you talked about U.S. investment in China, when the Obama administration came into office, it inherited a negotiation for a bilateral investment treaty with China. And that has continued to some extent, but the administration has been undertaking a review of that whole series of topics. So in the interest of kind of nailing down more specifically the U.S.-China investment relationship in both directions, how about telling us where both those issues stand and how you think they can best be handled?
Well, I think on the first question, I do think that the Chinese have perceived, for a number of reasons, a certain chill in the air when it comes to certain kinds of Chinese investment. There actually is a fair amount of Chinese investment here already, but it's not nearly what many Chinese would like to see. And we have had in the SNED a discussion of this issue, and we've had discussions in more informal surroundings as well, and sort of bilaterally. One of the reasons we want to engage the governors and the mayors more actively in this process is because, first of all, they're very eager to get Chinese investment. And second, in many cases, they have a better sense in their local area of the right way of addressing political considerations. And in fact, many mayors and governors do go to China to talk about this issue, and we're actually trying to arrange a much more active dialogue between Chinese government officials and Chinese companies and the National Governors Association and individual governors and individual mayors to deal with this political question. But you're absolutely right. There is a concern on the part of the Chinese, even when they're not CFIUS issues. And as you correctly point out, Fred, some of the issues where there has been a pushback have not been CFIUS related. They have been because there has been an adverse political reaction either in Washington or some part of the country. I think what is also important is for us to realize as a country that we need a constant inflow of foreign capital, even if we had a current account balance, which of course we don't. But even if we did, we would still benefit from foreign investment. It creates jobs, it brings new technology with it, it engages countries, as I mentioned, more actively in the American economy and engages them in a way that they're more part of our system. And there's been a lot of work. Steve Cantor has done a lot of work on this. When you look at, and I didn't go through all the details, but he's got them, on where this investment goes. And a lot of it goes in the manufacturing area. So that it creates, in fact, up until recently, the fifth biggest steel producer in the United States was a Russian company. It bought old American steel companies, some of which were about to shut down, and revitalized them. So we need this investment as part of the global economy, and a lot of it brings a lot of benefits with us. And where are the big investors? Clearly, Europe and China and South Korea and others, and Canada and Mexico are big investors. But increasingly, the large capital exporters like China, like India, which a large Indian company, for instance, has made a big investment in the Appalachians in natural gas in this new fracking process in natural gas. So these countries are interested in investing here. We have to find the right political formula that makes us more comfortable with their investment and makes them more comfortable investing here. And that's really what we're after. It's by no means easy, but I think there is a process of engagement underway. On the bits, for the moment, they're really not moving. We've been developing over the last, over a year, a model BIT. And you're right, we have had 6 sets of conversations with the Chinese on this. We've had several sets of conversations with other large economies. We think bilateral investment treaties are a positive idea, but we obviously have to find the right formulas that correspond to the needs of the business community, which by and large supports these, but also is responsive to the needs of the Congress. And within the Congress, there are different points of view of about what these should contain. And we're in the process of having conversations right now. We have had for several months. And of course, once we decide what the business community wants and what the Congress wants, then we also have to find ways of ensuring that these are negotiable with other countries. It's often possible to come up with something that on paper looks great, passes the muster of the Congress and the business community, but can't negotiate it. So we've got a sort of 3-way balance here. What our investment community wants, what the Hill wants, and what can be negotiated with other countries. And that is it's like a 3-dimensional tic-tac-toe. We're trying to organize this in a way that meets all 3 sets of objectives, and there are a lot of moving parts, and we haven't quite put all those parts together yet.
All right, let me shift to the international dimension, ask one other question. You ticked off, particularly at the end of your remarks, a daunting list of aspects of international investment where you called for better international understanding, agreement, consensus. And along the way, you quite rightly noted that you're now kind of forced to discuss those in a very wide range of different international institutions, depending on the topic. And that then raises the question, which in a way you raised yourself at the end, do we need a new international institution devoted to investment issues, as opposed to bringing some investment issues into WTO and some into OECD and UNCTAD, et cetera? Again, hearkening to our past, 30, 40 years ago, but even more recently, there was lots of talk about creating a GATT for investment. And the OECD even mounted a negotiation.
It was, as I recall, Bergston proposal.
Bergston proposal. Then the OECD mounted an effort on it a little over a decade ago. It failed. My enthusiasm for the idea cooled substantially. On the grounds, incidentally, that if you negotiated the issues, and with all due respect, foreign ministries got involved, you got a lot more ideology and theory impeding the way, whereas if you just let the investment go, everybody seemed to be competing to get it. So the status quo wasn't so bad. Nevertheless, you've ticked off all these issues that do need international attention. Certainly the environment would be improved if consensus, agreement could be reached. So have you thought about dusting off that old idea of going for a new international institution, a WTO for investment, or whatever one would call it these days, in an effort to have a coherent format, institutional framework for the kinds of rules and norms that you talked about across so many specific issues?
Well, I think that we've looked at a number of options, that being one of them. But it's not a likely option anytime soon, and therefore we really haven't given it a serious consideration. But what we have tried to do is figure out how we can utilize the OECD and the UNCTAD more effectively. And one of the reasons I went to this conference, this World Investment Forum in China, in Xiamen Island, was to chair a group of emerging and industrialized countries together to identify and to dig a little more deeply into the kind of issues I've raised, the role of state enterprises, corporate responsibility, intellectual property, anti-bribery, anti-corruption, things of this nature, and figure out how there could be a greater degree of cooperation among these two institutions on these matters. Now, what's interesting about these two institutions is that the WTO focuses on part of them, particularly the Government Procurement Code, and it also has some other elements. But the institutions that most countries use as the daily or ongoing forum for discussing these are the OECD and UNCTAD. And UNCTAD has, in the eyes of most developing countries, a high level of legitimacy. The OECD is sort of the institution, the preferred institution for the industrialized countries, although much to the credit of Angel Gurria and others, they're now doing an outreach program, so they're bringing more and more emerging economies, even those that are not full members of the OECD, into the dialogue on issues such as foreign investment. So our preferred course of action, and the one that we think is most realistic at this moment, and the one that actually I've been working on a lot, is to make sure that we have a greater measure of cooperation between UNCTAD and the OECD, and that we raise these issues wherever we can. For instance, as I mentioned, we're going to try to discuss the anti-corruption issue in the G20. That's going to bring in developed and emerging economies as well. So at the moment, there's no one single preferred institution. Our goal is to raise these issues in whatever institution we think is most likely to make progress, and also to make sure that there is a sufficient degree of coordination among the key institutions so that they're not operating at cross purposes. And by and large, I've been very gratified to see that there is a great deal of cooperation between UNCTAD and the OECD and the WTO. Even though they focus sometimes on different things, there's a notion of communality in the way they deal with a lot of these issues. At least there's a congruity among the kinds of things that they're focusing on.
Okay, many thanks. Floor is open for questions, comments, advice on any of this. Let me ask you to introduce yourself, where you're from, and then fire away. Gary, and then one over here.
Gary Elfbauer with the Peterson Institute. Well, thanks, Bob, for the wide-ranging survey. One subject you didn't touch on is a soundbite we've heard often from the White House, that is using tax breaks to ship jobs overseas, which carries with it the implication that there's too much investment by U.S. multinationals abroad generally, and that it's much too inspired by tax breaks. And so my question to you is whether you kind of subscribe to this general philosophy that there's a lot of unwanted investment by U.S. firms abroad, and what would you or the State Department like to do? Would you like to slash back on deferral, or do you have some other favorite method for keeping these corporations at home?
Thank you, Gary. I'll stay out of the tax-related issue, but let me make a broader point. And that is that there is certainly some American investment overseas that takes jobs that would be in American jobs at home and transfers them overseas. That does occur. That is a reality. But there is also a lot of American investment abroad that is essential, because for most companies that export from the United States, it'd be very hard for them to export to big markets unless there was some investment presence in those markets. And just the way modern corporations work, and it's the way other countries work. If you did not have a presence in a large country, an investment presence, they would be much less inclined to buy the products that you produce in the United States. And I'll give you a very real and very recent example of that. Boeing just made a very large sale of airplanes to Russia. This was announced and signed in Sochi a week and a half ago. And big sale with a lot of jobs created in the United States. And President Putin, at the signing ceremony, made the point that one of the advantages Boeing had was that it also had a research facility in Russia that employed 1,500 Russians. Now, this is an example. Without that, would the Russians have bought the planes or not? I don't know. I can't read their mind. But the fact that that Putin said this, I think illustrates the point that in this modern complex world, for many companies who want to export from the United States and want to create jobs here and want to sustain jobs here, they'll find it very difficult to do unless they have some investment in other countries. And without going into the tax issue, that would be my answer, that in this modern sophisticated global world, there is a very close interrelationship for many companies between their presence in other countries and their ability to export from the United States to those other countries.
At the risk of offending our long-term friendship, would you care to offer a judgment on the balance between the investments in category A that export jobs and in category B that create jobs?
I think I'll leave it where I left it.
Because some of us here,
interest of my survival as a.
Some of us here at the Institute think this is one on which the administration has the sign wrong, and we can debate it at another occasion. But just to register,
debate it on another occasion. I'm sure we will.
Yes. Okay.
Hi, Jim Berger from Washington Trade Daily.
Hi.
You mentioned a couple of times in your speech the importance of the private companies abroad pushing their own governments to liberalize investment laws because as they move outward, they may run into these same barriers. Are you suggesting a return to yesteryear of the reciprocal trade policy of the United States?
I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm not suggesting that. I am simply saying, and this goes back to Fred's first question. That is, if there are barriers to the ability of American companies to operate, or the barriers of the American companies that are operating abroad to sell in another country, then in the United States, and not just in the United States, and elsewhere also, there are going to be a lot of political pressure saying, if we don't have a level playing field abroad, why should those other investments from those countries have a level playing field here? Why should they enjoy rights in the United States or in Europe or in Japan or you name it that American companies don't enjoy in their country? Intellectual property, similar thing. Now I'm not threatening or trying to make a point other than simply saying that if people perceive that there is an imbalance or that there is an insufficient fairness with respect to the ability of American companies to export abroad to a given country or their American companies to operate fairly in that country, then you're going to get pushback here against their investments, and not just their investments, other aspects of their presence in the United States. This is an issue, even if the federal government didn't decide it was going to change policy dramatically to respond, then you'd get a lot of pressure politically to say, why are you not sufficiently defending the interests of American exporters or companies, and what can we do at home to rebalance the imbalance? And that's a reality. You hear that a lot. I'm not making this stuff up. If you go to various parts of the country, they will say if American products or companies aren't treated in a fair way abroad, then we should be much less inclined to do so at home. On the other hand, to put it in a more positive way, which is the way I'd like to put it, if you can make the argument that American products and American companies are treated fairly in another country, you can help to counter a lot of the resistance that is being faced in the United States. And that's where I would like to go in this process. I'd like to see there be enough of an argument made that can be made in this country that other countries do have a level playing field, that they're treating American companies fairly, they're protecting American intellectual property. That helps us enormously to counter the kind of resistance we're getting in this country in some, not all, but in some areas. I'll give you an example. This large investment was Reliance, that invested in the Marcellus area, which is an area where there's a lot of natural gas. Indian company, big investment. Was not any resistance there. You didn't hear a political outcry or anything else. And it's largely because a lot of American companies find that when they produce in India, they can sell it to the Indian government. They don't have the same kind of barriers or impediments or things. Now there are rules and regulations in India, we know that. But the general feeling was that there's a relatively level playing field. You didn't hear any of that about this large investment in a big gas field in the United States. So it does help if other countries are willing to play by these global rules and adhere to these global norms. It certainly helps to avoid the kind of domestic resistance that you otherwise would get when their companies wanted to invest here.
Okay, we've got two up here, then we'll go back for two and try to make them succinct, both questions and answers, as we're getting down to our last 10 minutes.
Thank you. Brad Smith with the American Council of Life Insurers. If I could quickly ask, to draw together two of the points you made about developed countries leading by example and state-owned enterprises. A specific example of Japan. In the next several weeks, the Japanese government is going to put forward a proposal for the reform of Japan Post, which is the world's largest financial services company. Can I just ask what priority that's given in the bilateral relationship? You've mentioned different modalities or different mechanisms to discuss it, the WTO, OECD, G20. Can you just mention what of those you're exercising? Thank you.
Alan Wolf and I correspond on a regular basis about this very issue. The answer is we're giving it a huge amount of attention. It comes up in virtually every conversation we have with the Japanese. We want a level playing field between Japan Post and private companies, and we want to ensure that Japan complies with its WTO obligations as they relate to services in general, in this case in particular. We have raised this issue on a regular basis. It is a very high priority issue. I can say for certain I've never had a conversation with the Japanese since I've been in office, except for the first time when I forgot about it, but Alan reminded me in an email very quickly to stop forgetting about it. But since then, I have raised in every single conversation I've had with the Japanese, and so have virtually every other senior official of the United States, virtually every senior official of the United States. I
might add, as you may know, the Institute's weighed in on that one too. Gary Huffbauer did a very powerful brief outlining the issue, indicating how Japanese practice is really inconsistent with their obligations, including to their own citizens in a way. And so we too have weighed in very heavily on that one.
It's an important issue. It's important to the insurance industry, and it's important in terms of the principle of adherence to the WTO. And it's important in terms of if the Japanese don't adhere to the WTO, this is a big modern economy. What does it say to others? So this is a top issue. I can assure you, every conversation I have with the Japanese, I raise this, and many other senior officials do likewise.
Steve?
Hi, Steve Cantor with the U.S. Council for International Business. Fred, just a footnote on outward investment in jobs. When you look at the BEA data, they pretty much track when multinationals here create jobs. It also tracks pretty much where they're creating jobs overseas. And when job creation, the rate of overseas job creation by multinationals slows down. It slows down here. I don't know which is cause and which is effect, but somehow this notion that the multinationals are abandoning the U.S. economy is false. And Matt Slaughter has done some studies that we've shared with you. And Bob.
Matt Slaughter, in fact, when I gave a speech before Steve's group, the point that Matt Slaughter raises is a very compelling point, and with a lot of very clear evidence that there is for many companies, and as I say, there are certain companies that do outsource. There are a lot of companies that are very critically important to our exports, and one reason they're able to export is that they have a presence in a lot of these countries.
I wanted to pick up on a point that you made, Bob, about competitive neutrality. And while you're probably not aware, because this is really getting in the weeds, but in 10 days, the OECD's working group on governance is looking at neutrality in the governance sense. And how do you achieve this? And their answer seems to be that if countries adhered to the guidelines for state-owned enterprises, things would be okay. I would suggest that the issue of neutrality is much broader than just governance. You've got direct and indirect subsidies, state assistance to companies, local content, WTO rules, and of course indigenous technology. This whole issue of competitive neutrality, particularly with China and other emerging countries, is a huge issue for our member companies, for global companies. And I'm wondering to what extent you can share with us your thinking as to how you're trying to pull all of these pieces together to really create a level playing field, to use a hackneyed term.
Well, Steve, I'm glad you're actually, I was just at the OECD yesterday, so I'm aware that they're doing this, and I use this as sort of a short, you're going to be there, as sort of a shorthand way of looking at it, but there are many elements. I tried to list a few that were other than competition policy, for instance, tax incentives for management. There are a whole range of things that relate to this very question. And no, I think it's extremely important. Again, it's one of these, the point I was trying to make is that people at the end of the 1940s, 1950s, they had to deal with one set of issues. This is in a way a new kind of 21st century issue where you have these large state enterprises or state champions, and they generally, not all in all cases, but generally play by a different set of rules, or even if they don't play by a different set of rules, they have different sets of circumstances internally which give them certain advantages that a purely private company wouldn't have. And our goal is to make sure that there is a level playing field. I use competitive neutrality since it's sort of a way of putting a lot of this stuff under the same rubric. But there are many elements of this that are going to be discussed at the OECD, and we are very, very clear about the need to make sure there is a level playing field. And to do that, you really have to look internally at national policies, at tax policies, at internal governance, at the whole range of things that you looked at. This is an important issue, again, because I made this point that sort of state capitalism has become a more attractive feature to some governments, not just China. And therefore, if this continues, it puts private companies that have to raise private money in private markets at a disadvantage, because companies that have government benefits or government support find it much easier to raise capital because they have the government behind them, but also much easier to do things in a competitive landscape that would be harder for a private company to do because of the advantages and benefits they get from government. This is certainly a priority, and it's something we've taken up and will continue to take up in the OECD. I'd be happy to talk to you about it further.
To the back.
Thanks. Revenge of the Garys. Gary Kleiman from Kleiman International Consultants. Thanks,
Hey, Gary.
Mr. Undersecretary. Just a very fast question specifically on the friction between the U.S. and China on FDI in the financial sector specifically. You know, a lot of U.S. institutions argue that banking and securities opening is going very slowly, and they still have to get permission to expand their branches, and obviously their market share and profitability is very low, if non-existent. Here, the Chinese have complained that for years, the Fed delayed in approving licenses for branches in New York, and the SEC has just rejected the application by their major credit rating agency to get nationally recognized status. Is this an impediment to broader cooperation, maybe? Or can you address, if you can as well, the specific issues in that sphere, although that's probably more Treasury than state?
Yeah, the answer is I can't and shouldn't address the specific issues because for the reasons you mentioned, they relate to either the Treasury or in the case you've mentioned, the SEC. This is a very complicated area. This the question of who gets what licenses and the whole financial thing. As you know, the Chinese made certain commitments in the financial services sector. When they joined the WTO, they've been slow to implement a number of those commitments. They have issues that they point to that they face in the United States. I just can't tell you there's an easy answer. I can tell you that this issue comes up regularly at the SNED and in other conversations, but there's no sort of one answer that would answer your question at this point. This is an ongoing dialogue where the appropriate agencies are actively involved. But let me just say something about the Chinese in a somewhat broader way. I know it doesn't answer exactly your question about banking changes and banking reform. In some areas, the Chinese have actually, on the financial side, using their finance ministry, played quite a constructive role. During the financial crisis, they worked very closely. I mean, John Lipsky's here, he knows 10 times more about this than I do, but they work very closely with the IMF, they work very closely in the Financial Stability Board. The skill of their financial experts and their financial officials is very high. You're dealing with a number of very sophisticated people who have come to understand our banking system and our financial system and the global system a lot better than say 10 years ago. So there's an ongoing dialogue, pretty regular dialogue, between the Federal Reserve and the PBOC and between the Treasury and the Chinese Finance Ministry. So while there are the kind of frustrations that you point to, there's also a very, very good dialogue. And the Chinese, they do understand that they have a big stake in the financial system. I think they've come to understand that it's very important. So the cooperation on some of the broader financial issues is quite good. And even the dialogue on some of these smaller issues is good. It's just that there's slower progress.
With apologies to several of you that have questions, we're at our witching hour. So Patrick, you get the last question.
Thank you, Fred. Bob, Pat Malloy, I'm with the U.S.China Commission. I thought it was a great presentation. You hit a lot of the issues that we worry about. I think it would be important, though, to distinguish between, and we used to do this in this country, between greenfield investment and acquisition investment. I think that's something that has now fallen off the radar screen, but should be put back on. On the issue of the China and the WTO, my understanding is that their WTO agreement said that they would not force companies to transfer technology for market access. I was reading an article in the Financial Times dated September 23rd called China, A Future on Track, which is devoted to the whole issue of how the Chinese, in order for the Western companies to get market access in important areas of the growing part of their economy, they insist they go in by a joint venture and that they transfer the technology to the Chinese partner. And then the article goes on to say, then the companies find that after a while, they're losing market share in China, and they've created an international competitor in global markets.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, is this an issue that you were addressing in your conversations with the Chinese?
Well, that was one of the points I was trying to make. Yes, it's a very big issue.
This is a little different than the government procurement.
No, there's the government procurement. That's the indigenous innovation question.
Yeah.
Who's on the accredited list for government procurement?
Yeah.
And that is the list is suspended at this point, as you know. But before it was suspended, the very strong link was to who created the technology, the know-how, the innovation, or who owns it, and your ability to be accredited to put on the list for accreditation to be sold, for the product to be sold to the government. That's one set of issues. Then there's another, you're referring to a broader set of issues. The broader set of issues is your ability to, in some cases, meet Chinese standards or comply with Chinese regulations, or in some cases to do business, but it's more through standards and regulations. And in many cases, in order to meet those standards, you have to comply with certain requirements to, for instance, explain what's in your software code, your source code, for instance, and then, which means divulging a lot of information to meet the standards. Now, we have standards too, and we require a certain amount of disclosure. The problem is that where the disclosure to the government then turns around and becomes disclosure from whoever got that information to a Chinese company, which in turn uses it to compete against you in their market or in some other market. That's another issue. We're quite aware of the charges. One of the points I raised was that American companies have made a number of very specific sets of charges against the Chinese in areas that are very similar to what you've described, and doubtless some of them talked to the people who wrote that article. We take this very seriously. We've had very serious conversations with the Chinese about this. And let me make the broader point is this. This is extremely important to the United States, and not just the United States. The Germans and the French, when I was there a couple days ago, raised the same set of issues.
Yes.
It's important because our future strength, current and future, is innovative companies with innovative products. If those innovations are transferred away to competitive companies abroad, China or elsewhere, that hurts the companies now, but it also hurts their economic futures. So we not only do we focus on this issue, we regard it as a very high priority because it's a jobs issue and it's a competitive issue at home. So we're constantly in contact with American companies who have concerns about this and who provide us with very specific sets of data on what's happening.
Bob, thank you very, very much. We're glad you're on all these cases. We encourage you to keep going. Come back and share your results with us in another 6 months, and we'll keep on track.
Thank you, Fred.
Thanks again.